Yep.
Okay, hi Sven, and thank you for taking the interview. And so you are a philosopher, a Swedish philosopher. Oh, sorry. Okay, nation doesn't matter. And you focus on aesthetics. So
Yeah.
this is very interesting to me. So I'm gonna, start with like big questions, and then we see where we get. So do you have one single idea that explains everything, like what I call a narrative? I'm a marketer, so I use this term narrative. Something that explains all your beliefs.
No, to be honest, no. And I think there's a philosophy. I mean, some philosophers have, but for the idea of philosophy anyway, the way I practice it is to think about big things and then take them apart and see they're composed of many various parts, and there's always a temptation in philosophy. Perhaps it's one of the temptations of philosophy, to have one big idea, one big thing, and some philosophers have. But for me, no. I tend to see things in highly, I hope at least, in a highly differentiated way. There's this very funny essay by Isaiah Berlin, which is called I think, the Hedgehog and the Fox. He
Mm.
says that something that is, I mean, it's not just philosophers, also writers and architects and artists. That some people are foxes. They know many, many small things, and some are hedgehogs. Just know one big thing.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
the problem is this, that many foxes believe themselves to be hedgehogs and many hedgehogs to be foxes. So of course, I mean, there are two sides in each person, but I would see myself, and my writing, I think, evinces this. I am more of a fox than a hedgehog.
Okay. And do you think there is either of them is bad or good or whatever? They are
No,
both
no,
their own
no.
role.
There is uh, as I said, there is a temptation to become a fox, or to become a hedgehog, because the hedgehog has, as it were, higher stats in philosophy. You have one big theory, one big claim, whereas the fox-like attitude is more that you somehow disrupt things. And I think both are needed. I think both are
Hmm.
needed, and one has to be aware of one's own temptations and one's own
Hmm.
tendencies. But no, I mean, no one of them is a priori somehow better than the other.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to force myself to be a hedgehog. Trying
Yeah,
to have this big idea because it helps me with all the chaos in life.
yeah,
How to deal with kids, how to deal with work, how to deal with anything. So I'm kind of trying to develop this idea that guides me, which is that the change in society is through technology.
yeah,
That's the main change.
yeah,
Unfortunately, that's how I see it. And but I'm also very interested in how philosophy and general thinking influences that, and how aesthetics influence, because it's not that simple. It's not like we get a spaceship and then that's it. And I kind of believe that people were the same 50,000 years ago, more or less. What changed is we are figuring out how to make stuff. And again, this is extremely simple. So I'm going to ask you questions related to that. I'm
yeah.
simplifying it to make it more fun. So I mean, how do you think change happens in society? What kind of change do we experience over 1,000 years, 20 years?
I mean, obviously, a very fox answer to this. There are many ways in which changes occur, because obviously, because of technological development, because of the social changes, unrest, revolutions, earthquakes, asteroids hitting the earth. I mean, there's a whole wide variety of ways in which change occurs, and I don't think there's any one single answer to this. I mean, today we are, of course, experiencing technological change at a massive rate, and it seems, at least some people think, it seems to be that technology is the driving factor behind social change today. But of course, that's due to some extent, but there are also social reasons. Technology, on the one hand, produces a kind of leveling of the world. Everything becomes the same. On the other hand, it produces immense and profound differences and inequities all over the world. So, I mean, so there are many ways in which changes occur. And I think when you see a major change, say, the French Revolution or something like that, it's because the all these different factors at one moment in time, they come together, they form a kind of interlocking thing. And many different processes merge at one point in time, and then they come apart. So probably big changes have to do with this fusion of various factors. And today we are, we are in the midst of things as always, and so it's very difficult to say. But of course, technology is one key feature in the transformation of the world, but it's not the only feature. There's of course there's the overemphasis on technology, because it seems to be like the one-way street. It seems like a kind of deterministic thing that you have to go one direction, which I think is not true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, example, do you believe that there was someone like, I don't know, Kant, 50,000 years ago, maybe with not that terminology, with not that detail, but having that kind of feeling, the same, feeling that Kant had, just expressed in a different way? Meaning, is Kant like a pinnacle, the same as technology? Like we have, I don't know, spaceships today, is Kant the equivalent of that? Or is Kant something that occurs every 5,000 years, but maybe not in the same format,
I think if one looks at Kant specifically, of course, he was connected to his time, to late 18th century, and because of the developments in politics, which are rather different from our world, he was dependent on the evolution of the natural sciences, of Newtonian mechanics, and the evolution of mathematics, the various natural sciences. So Kant was, in some sense, or in a very profound sense, he was a child of his time, obviously, as we all are. But then the fact that makes Kant into such an important reference is not that he was somehow a part of his time, but that he also transcended his time. Hegel, who would come after Kant, would say that philosophy is not in time, nor is it outside of time, but it is about time. It's from that side. So in that sense, Hegel and Kant too would say that philosophy is a way to think the concept of the time that you are in, which is of course dependent on what's in your historical period. But philosophy has a certain way of transcending that and looking at that constellation of things from the outside, which does not mean that philosophy belongs to some other world, the Platonic realm of ideas or something. It's not a divine enterprise, but it has a certain transcendence, which is of course always conditioned by the factors that it transcends, but it's still not reducible to moment in time. Just like Descartes, for instance, was of course obviously completely dependent on the sciences of his time. Sciences that he himself invented in great respect. But his philosophy is not reducible to that particular moment in time in the history of sciences or of art or of aesthetics or politics. So philosophy is in its time, but it's also outside of its time in a particular way. So, and when we read Kant today, if we now take Kant as an example, we can obviously not go back, we cannot place ourselves in 1781 and read Critique of Pure Reason, the first edition, the way the people did in that day. That's impossible because we have all these things that have occurred in between. But I think the great works of philosophy have the capacity for surviving precisely because they're outside of their particular time. They have also a way of communicating with us on another level, which means that we read Kant today differently than he read himself. We have to, but there's something in the text which makes it worthwhile to read it. If he were just caught up in his own time, there would be no reason to read him because he would just belong to the late 18th century. He has something to say to us, but what he says is not what he thought he said. It is something that is only accessible to us because we read his problems in a different perspective. And I think art, to some extent, is the same. Art also shares this quality of being in its moment, but also outside of the moment. This is why we can read Greek tragedy and look at Rembrandt's paintings or read Racine's tragedies and see something else in those works than their authors did, because a lot of time has elapsed in between. But the works will survive because they accumulate interpretations, they accumulate the time in between, and they somehow reach us enriched with all that has happened in between. And I think this is the capacity of great works, that they stand a bit outside of their precise own temporal location.
So basically what I understood is that you're saying that they are the same as technology, meaning technology is constantly progressing and there was nothing before like something is today. So once it happens, it didn't happen before. It's impossible. It's a moment in time that improves the future. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And also because the way we read the past is not there, and in any kind of sense of given that we know what the past means. If one looks at, for instance, artworks or philosophical works or works of literature or whatever, because as I said, their meaning changes because of our point in time, our perspective, and which does not mean that we somehow misread them. Of course, we can misread them in a very simplistic way, but I mean, there's a kind of necessary misreading involved in looking at the past. So the past also changes. The meaning of the past changes because of our point in time.
Yeah.
This is why artworks or philosophical works that may have seemed just simply dead, they can be resuscitated and they can be brought back to life because suddenly they begin to speak to us because we have urgencies in our own present that makes them readable in a new way. So there's a kind of redistribution of the past that occurs constantly because of our vantage point in time.
Yeah. So, uh, thanks. What is your favorite technology at the moment? Like something that you're using daily, or what impresses you the most today?
Oh, I don't have, I mean, I have what I use every day is my cell phone and my computer, obviously,
Yeah.
like everyone else. I mean, I use Zoom all the time
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to note how the Zoom, now we're talking Zoom, and I have all my seminars, my teaching on Zoom. We have our staff meetings at Zoom. So it changes the way you behave, changes the way you dress, the way you
Yeah.
in your kitchen. So it has all these weird impacts on your everyday life. And that's interesting to note, and
Yeah.
it somewhat transforms the way we discuss, how we spend time, how we become in some senses much more effective, in other senses much less effective when we have meetings. So it's an interesting, I don't know if it's my favorite. Actually, I hate it a lot, of course, because you don't see people in real life, which is very boring.
We
But it's
wouldn't speak. We wouldn't speak without it. If there was no
yeah,
corona, I mean, we would continue liking each other's stuff on Facebook, but never
yeah.
actually interact. Yeah.
No, but I think it's interesting because it will also probably change. I mean, there's obviously in academia, it's very important to meet people. And after you have the lecture, you drink wine, you go to a bar, you have dinner, you discuss, and you're talking, you get to know someone. That's, of course, an essential part of intellectual life. But it's also this new situation makes it possible to have this kind of dialogues with people far away in other places of the world. We can invite people from America or China or Japan and have a Zoom seminar, which earlier would be very, very complicated and expensive. You have to plan like a year ahead to invite someone to Stockholm. Now we can have a Zoom seminar, like just plan one day before. So it will change. It will have, I think it will have profound impact on the way we think, exchange and discussion and seminar, but we will at the same time lose some of that, as it were, social interaction, which is also crucial. So it has, as all these technologies, it has its upside and its downside.
Well, the reason I'm asking you is that I'm trying, because I have this idea of technology, like changing the society, but I see it very much connected to philosophy, to aesthetics, to art. I don't, I don't divide them, to obviously, that would be crazy. But and I just wanted to ask you, okay, you chose Zoom, for example. So how does would Zoom be able be available? Would it exist if there was no, for example, Hegel or Kant? Is there a connection between those?
Well, I mean, it's different without Hegel or Kant. I mean, obviously Zoom wouldn't exist with a lot of the
Or I don't know, any other philosopher,
no, no, but there wouldn't. I mean, the whole computer world we know today wouldn't exist without Leibniz. I mean, because
Mm,
he invented, the arithmetic system with just one and zero, what we call the digital world. He invented this theory on the basis of his understanding of theology of God and metaphysics. So he came from a really a different perspective, but then of course he was also a mathematician. I mean, I would say most of the technology we have today would not have been invented in precisely the way that it was invented without certain philosophies that appeared earlier. Then of course it would have been invented anyway, but perhaps in some other fashion. So I mean, we cannot replay history in that way. But I mean, sometimes you see developments in logics and mathematics that seem at their own time completely abstract and without any connection to any kind of empirical world. Suddenly, 100 years later, suddenly they become crucial for every life. So in that sense, I mean, you never know what discoveries and theories and inventions and conceptual assemblages that are produced at one point in time, which ones will later emerge as important for every life. I mean, we probably have a lot of new inventions right now that we have no idea where they're going, but in 100 years time, we'll see, my God, this is really important.
yeah, yeah. So that's a great thing that you said. That basically from some kind of a philosophical and theological idea, we ended up with the whole with everything that we're using today.
Mm.
I didn't know that. I didn't make that connection. Now I'm thinking like, where does all the things that we're using today, they are coming from something from Renaissance and something from before that and something from before that,
Yeah.
and there is a clear line that connects them. But today we are learning. I mean, I'm also teaching. I'm teaching visual analysis at in design, and which is kind of like, and none of the students, none of the designers or product designers or anybody creating anything has that sense of connection and influence that came. They're looking at all the history, all the philosophy, and all the art as kind of an entertaining thing,
Yeah.
like an extra thing, but they don't see it as a necessary thing that led, and that means that they're neglecting what they should know today.
Yeah.
Do you think it's dangerous that people who create things don't have a big connection to the philosophy and art? I mean, there is a lot of people making things, machines, and that we're all using, like iPhone and stuff,
No,
all the time, and they don't seem to have much of a connection to this
no, I
philosophy and
don't
art.
think it's dangerous. It's probably inevitable because if you're doing very specialized things, you're doing very specialized things, and you're probably there. I mean, your life is limited. There's only so much that you can actually grasp in your intellectual involvement. No, I don't think it's dangerous. But I mean, if one, I would like to come back to this idea of invention. You mentioned Kant, but I would like to just mention another invention that I think is a really interesting case of how philosophy and the sciences and the arts come together in a particular way. If one looks at, you mentioned the Renaissance. Let's look at the central perspective and developed by these people in the early 15th century, like Alberti and others. So I mean that was dependent on a certain development of geometry and mathematics. But if one looks at Alberti's writings, he really had no idea how central perspective worked. I said, I speak like a painter, he said. He was not a mathematician. So he really didn't have a grasp of how come perspective actually worked in that way. That took more than 200 years for a mathematician like Desargues and then a philosopher like Descartes to explain why central perspective occurred. And he said, central perspective works the way it does because space is infinite, it is homogeneous, it is infinite, homogeneous, like the coordinate system, and any point can be connected to any other point, and there are no privileged points in space. So this uniformization, this kind of creation of a systemic space, as Panofsky said in his book on perspective, is one side. The other side is that this is how the world looks from a particular point of view. The Cartesian cogito, the subject has a world extended outside of itself, like an image, like a picture. You can see how Descartes construes this idea of an extended thing, res extensa, as an image, where you can have the perspective lines intersect in infinity. So the world looks as if it were an infinite homogeneous space from the point of view of something that is outside that space. So the subject is required for the world to appear as a picture, as Hardy would say, as a Weltbild, the world picture. So Descartes invents the idea of the subject, the cogito, the subject that thinks, as a way to explain why the world looks the way it does to a mathematician. So he picks up everything he knew about the history of art, everything he knew about mathematics, geometry, central perspective, and drawing on that, he also produced a new philosophical concept, the concept of the subject. And as Gilles Deleuze once said, everyone knows what it means to exist. Everyone knows what it means to doubt something. Everyone knows what it means to think or to be, to have a body, to exist, to doubt. But Descartes put all of that together into a new constellation, and he created something that is called the cogito, I think. Everyone has said before, yeah, I think, what's the problem with that? He said, this cogito, I think, means something particular, because it is only on the basis of that idea that we can understand why the rest of the world looks the way it does to the one who thinks. So he drew on the sciences, on art history, on geometry, mathematics, on everyday knowledge, and brought this together into a new concept. And he created something that is somehow made up of a lot of things that existed before, but it is also really new invention to think in that way. So in that sense, I think artists do the same and philosophers do the same. They draw on all kinds of experiences and raw materials that exist in history, but they put them together in a new way, which makes it possible to pose new questions, and the world will look different. And then you can, of course, emphasize the fact that all of these elements existed. You say, oh, there's nothing new with Descartes. He only placed all these old things in a new arrangement. You can also say, yeah, sure, but the interesting thing is the novelty of the arrangement, that he actually did something entirely new. So I think art and philosophy in that sense, when inventions are made, they are neither something that comes from an empty space. You're not like a creatio ex nihilo, like the creation out of nothing, as is in the old theology, but neither are they simply ways of rearranging what exists. But they are rearrangements of what exists, but the novelty of what they produce is that which transcends the particular constellation. And this is why we can still go back and look at Renaissance painting and read the Cartesian text and say, oh my God, what's happening here? Because the sense of novelty is that which prevents it from simply being enclosed in their particular moment in time, which makes it possible for us to reinterpret them and add new things to them. So in that sense, that's what I meant by say about history is being remade all the time. But and Descartes remade history, and we will read Descartes and remake history once more by rereading him and placing his concepts in a new constellation. Okay. This was a very complicated answer, but I hope it made sense.
No, I understand what you're saying. I'm just stuck. I just got afraid a little bit when you were talking about. I got scared by a specific thing you said previously. So my mind was on what you're saying, but also on this thing that stuck with me most is that everybody's specialized now, and you are mentioning Descartes and all these people that were, and you're explaining that they were very universal people, Renaissance men, basically, like Alberti and Palladio and all these people. They were very, they knew a lot of things and they had a lot of influence. But yet then you said that we have that specialization is inevitable.
Yeah.
And this draws also to a couple of other interviews that I did with some software developers and product designers that we spoke about the danger of specialization, I guess the Marxian thing or whatever it is. And that's what I'm afraid of, is that today people are making things, like me, I'm a maker. I make products, I make final things. I would love to be able to write a book, but I'm not able. At the end, they always come back to making a single thing, which is kind of a software thing. And that's what I'm made for. But, but I still try to get some information outside. But there are so many people who are purely specialized and they are becoming, and this scares me a lot, because they don't have this wide knowledge, that you are just mentioning with all these people. Do you think there is disappearing this idea of wide knowledge, of being able to draw from philosophy and art, that connection, that people are becoming more and more, as we become more specialized?
Yeah, of course, it has to do with the organization of society, organization of the university in particular, because everyone has to be specialized. In order to have money for research, you have to be very specialized in your own particular field. So in that sense, it's a kind of bureaucratization of knowledge, and it is I don't know if it's inevitable, but at present it seems to be a process that simply goes on forever. Yeah. In academia, but I mean there are counter movements, and I think philosophy is perhaps one such counter thing, because I mean there are philosophers who are completely specialized in certain technical problems in mathematics, logic, philosophy of language, but there are also others who think about totality, as it were, then I mean totality not in a kind of theological sense, but totality in the sense of trying to bridge different fields and think of other types of problems. So I think philosophy is anyway, the way I see it, is not really specialized in that sense, because it thinks about connections, and it thinks about how the sciences and the arts, how they hang together. And this is why, the concepts that are produced by philosophy are not the same as the concepts produced in art or the concepts produced in the sciences, because they have a different place and they are different. They cannot be verified in the same sense as a concept in the sciences. And if you speak to someone who's working in the CERN accelerator, they would discuss, subatomic particles in a particular way, in a highly technical way, and they produce theories that can be verified or falsified or tested against reality. I mean, philosophy does not produce things that can be tested in that sense. I mean, the answer to a philosophical question is not an empirical observation or a mathematical formula. And art too produces something which is, different from both philosophy and the arts or the sciences, and they exist in a kind of parallel spheres, but they also interact. So specialization is inevitable, but there are moments when different fields overlap and interact, and I think philosophy is one way of making that happen, and art is another way of making that happen. Then of course the problem is then, if your work as an artist or philosopher is to be judged by the standards of the sciences, it looks like fake, because it's what you produce is not concepts or theories or hypotheses on the same level as the other sciences, be it the natural, social, or human sciences. It's a different type of concepts, which is why people, why people think that, the philosophy will save us. Others say philosophy is useless. So,
Yeah.
I mean, both of these attitudes are caused by the fact that philosophy is a bit different. It is not one of the sciences, and it cannot be one of the sciences, because philosophy is about what the meaning of the word science is, and what we understand by science. So, as I said, the same thing about immanence and transcendence. It is always conditioned by the sciences and what we're doing in the other fields of experience, but it is not equivalent to that. It is a kind of reflection that occurs, reflection and a creation which is outside of the other spheres, which makes it at the same time overinflated and reacted at the same time.
Well, a lot of sciences are like that. I mean, not all sciences are like physics.
No. Yeah.
So a lot of sciences need to make extreme claims. But I come from product design area,
Yeah.
which is like another area. There is
Yeah.
the art, there is philosophy, there is science, and there are people. There are us who make products. Like our job is to sit in a basement somewhere, make a prototype, and try to get 10 million people to use it, and hopefully their world changes a little bit. They have a better toothbrush or something, or an app to call a taxi. How would you make a perfect designer, perfect person making something commercially? How would you create that? Like what a person like that should read, what a person like that should know. What?
You mean how you're supposed to be trained in a design school, or well,
Just forget the school. Just if you want to create, someone tells you can create a perfect designer who's going to make a perfect product to make a perfect world. What would that person need to know in art, philosophy, anything?
you wouldn't have to know everything, of course.
Whoa.
No, but I mean,
You said there is a time limit. There is a limit. Yeah.
No, but I mean, the question is impossible, of course, and specifically, it's not up to me to say what would it take to be a designer, because I'm not a designer. But then again, I was teaching before I was back in philosophy university. I was teaching in art schools for many years, and so I think, this problem, I think what you're asking, anyway, what I can contribute to the question is, how do you relate theories to practice, and what is the use of particular theories in practice? I was teaching in art schools. I was teaching a bit of art history. We call it art theory, which is more like philosophy, but it also involved many other disciplines. And I was always saying to the students that obviously you're not becoming philosophers, and you don't have to read Kant or whatever you read, Lacan or Freud or Nietzsche or whatever, Wittgenstein, whatever they were reading. Of course, you can read whatever you want, and I can help you to understand what you're reading. But you're not going to become academics, write a PhD on Kant's transcendental philosophy. That's not what you're doing. But if you read something which has a certain philosophical dimension to it, you will be able to use concepts and draw something out of them, which is something different than what I would extract to them as an academic philosopher. And it's not a question of being right or wrong here, but I'm just saying that I wouldn't use the word apply, but if you use philosophical or theoretical things as an artist or as a designer, you will obviously change them, because there's no point in applying something and leaving it unchanged, because if the concepts come into contact with some particular material, it will also change the concepts. Anyway, that's what I feel is the right answer. So one shouldn't worry about disfiguring or deforming concepts, but you have to worry about how should they be deformed. They will be deformed, either way, but you will think, how can I somehow deform the concepts in a way that is productive for me as a designer and as an artist, which I think then in turn can also be productive for the philosopher. So you have to know a little bit about what you're doing. It's like you have a tool. Of course you can use a tool without having any knowledge of where it comes from and how it was originally intended to work. You can use a hammer to do all kinds of things, as it were. But if you know something about the tool, the history of the tool, and how it was intended, and the debates that somehow surrounded this particular tool when it emerged, you will probably be able to understand better how to transform it. And I'm saying, so a certain type of knowledge it's not going to be a sufficient condition for you doing something interesting, but it might be a perhaps not even a necessary condition, but it might be useful for you. You will be able to use the tool in a better way if you know something. So I think theory and concepts are I mean, theories are not there to be applied, not even art, they're not there to be applied, but they are meant to be used as tools, and tools
I
can be
mean,
used.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. While you were talking, I'm having flashbacks
Yeah,
of my entire life to the first ideas that I had. And I'm connecting the product that I'm designing now, that I'm applying for millions of euros. And I'm connecting to the initial ideas of like whatever, when I was a kid, of anarchism and Bakunin, and then developing them back to the product. And I feel what you're saying, you know, in a sense, this was the kind of the block for me, that you just explained that the theory is taking a new shape, and in the, you know, today for me, and it serves my own ambition, you know, my own idea of design, and it gives me a direction, whether, you know, it comes from me or it comes from the theory. They're merging together and becoming something practical. And I mean, you just, you know, sorry, you just helped me a lot, you know.
yeah,
This is
yeah.
like a really like a big moment for me. Thank you.
But I think it's also the same thing if one, this is also my experience of teaching in, you know, art schools. And as I said earlier, now some people say, yeah, philosophy is going to save me. Others would say philosophy is just useless. I was saying it's not going to save you, not going to destroy you, but it might help you in some
Yeah,
cases to
yeah,
do
yeah,
what you want
yeah.
to do.
Well, what I noticed is that there are people who believe in horrible ideologies, like that really don't fit my most of the ethical standards, but they produce wonderful products as well.
Yeah,
There is that case, you know, they are, when they are talking, they are saying strange things and it doesn't really work, but the output is amazingly that are actually completely contradictory, because
yeah,
something inside of them, they take things and they're talking about strange things, but the output, actual practical result, if you eliminate what they're talking about and how they're thinking, but the output is amazing, you know. This is also what I noticed in product designers, you know. They should maybe, and they consume philosophy, they consume art, they consume all the wrong things, what I consider wrong things. Majority would maybe agree, ethically and aesthetically wrong things, but their output is
yeah,
like 10 out of 10, is amazing, you know. That's also strange, a bit scary thing, you know,
yeah.
because how can you judge? um I wanted to ask you, I mean, thank you very much. You just kind of explained
Yeah.
a lot of things for me. Yeah, I wanted to ask you another thing. So, you know, there's this, you know, as you said, there is a lot of change happening through technology, and it's very important. And, but how can technology be separated from aesthetics? You know, because in many cases, it's actually a form of aesthetics, not really a practical change. And, you know, where does aesthetic start and when does practical? Because a lot of practical pragmatic people like to pretend aesthetics is not relevant. Well, it seems to me like it's all aesthetics. People react to aesthetics mostly.
Yeah, we know, of course, aesthetics is always part of it. I mean, I remember there was this fun discussion about, you know, when, you know, back in the day when we had the competition between Telia and Nokia, you know, the Finnish cell phone company, the Swedish cell phone company. The problem was everyone wanted Nokia because the Telia phones were designed by engineers and they had no sense of what a phone should look like. They would be practical. So whereas the Nokia had no expert designers who looked like, you know, sexy phones. So in that sense, of course, aesthetics is part of it in the very simplistic sense that you need to sell things. They need to be attractive and look interesting and new and whatever. But I mean, that's a simple thing. But I think also technology, of course, has a profound impact, and it always draws on aesthetics. If one looks at, you know, the early modernist movement in the early 20th century, architecture, design, as it were, you know, the Bauhaus, Le Corbusier, Russian constructivism, they would reject the notion of aesthetics because they thought that, you know, aesthetics is a kind of, you know, it's a set of rules for beauty that go back to antiquity. We need to think differently. We need to, you know, we need to create, you know, the artist slash engineer, as Rodchenko said. So they would reject the discourse of aesthetics. But I think what they did was they invented a new aesthetic, of course. They invented a new way of making things looking up to date, modern, flexible, connected to our bodies, which was a different sense of the aesthetic. It was just a transformed aesthetic. So if one thinks of aesthetics not as a kind of strict canon of rules for I mean, beauty, and hasn't been that since I mean that idea of the aesthetic, in fact, disappeared when the very term aesthetics appeared in the 18th century. So aesthetics was always about to investigate how things affect our senses. And this is how the term aesthetics was, you know, invented in the 1730s, 40s, and 50s. It was, you know, a way of discarding academic rules and proportions, and, you know, that you could learn how to make a work of art because it would appear as being, you know, consonant with certain theories in the academies. Of course, the works were never consonant with theorists anyway, but that was the official discourse. But then aesthetics, aesthetics displaced poetics, and poetics was a theory of rules that you could learn first and then apply them to an object, whereas aesthetics said, well, you have to make an object, and then you have to feel if it's interesting, beautiful, sublime, or whatever the vocabulary was. So aesthetics says you have to begin with the thing, and then you experience, and then you think, how come this thing affects me in a certain way? So aesthetics was from the outset directed against the idea that there will be firm rules for anything being beautiful. Aesthetics is about transforming the subject, and I think, and when the early avant-garde in the early 20th century rejected the term aesthetics or the canons of beauty, they were really just not transforming aesthetics. They were truly aesthetic. If you look at Russian constructivism, they wanted to get rid of old canons, but they wanted to produce flexible objects that would be close to your body, that would transform your living space, that would really be a way to restructure your whole living space. And they had to do that by, on the one hand, being efficient and flexible and functional, on the other hand, showing this in a certain way to show that this way of living was desirable. So in that sense, it was also aesthetics. So aesthetics is always part of technology, at least to the extent that it's supposed to be bought and sold and become part of everyday life. There's an everyday aesthetic, and that can definitely not be evacuated at all.
But where does, I mean, like futurism, I was just thinking about futurism as you were talking as well. So, but is there a point where aesthetics ends? Like, for example, is from family like a form of aesthetic, or is that like a pragmatic, practical, biological thing? Where does it end? Where do people invent things because they want something to be beautiful the way they want it to be beautiful, and change the nature and change everything because it's beautiful? I mean, like making rockets and going to space, it's an aesthetic thing to me.
Is
And
that the
where
family?
sorry?
The family, is that aesthetic?
Yeah, I don't know, where does it end as an example, like where does
Any kind of television commercial will show you that the family is totally aesthetic, right?
Yeah.
Everything you sell to a family has to do with the fact they want to look, appear in a certain way. So I mean, this is totally aestheticized in that sense.
But the fact that we have a family, like for example, is there something which is purely human and it cannot be manipulated or something? Where does it end? Where does aesthetics
No, but
end?
I don't think one should understand aesthetics as manipulation. As the aesthetic is part of being human, because we have a certain sense of beauty or the sublime or of taste. We have things that appeal to us, and that's inevitably a human thing. That, of course, what appeals to us, and that's, of course, depending on as Kant would say, Kant, we mentioned Kant in his critical judgment. He would say that this, of course, I know Kant would say in 1790 in his critical judgment that for a Chinese person, other things will look different than from someone who's living in Königsberg. And we will say this is beautiful, and we will say this is beautiful about different things, but both of us will say this is beautiful, because this, the sense of there being beauty is universal. Then, of course, what is beautiful is dependent on contingent circumstances. And so I think aesthetics is not manipulation. Of course, it can be a manipulative thing, but one cannot draw the line between something natural and something cultural here and that.
But as a designer, I'm thinking like that scares me again. It's like if we think everything is aesthetics, and for example, if we like it the way it is, that's good. But if we don't like it, and if we think it should be more beautiful, then we think we can change everything.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what designers do. They want to change everything
Yeah.
that they don't like, if they don't like it. So I mean, then there is no limit in what we want to change, the nature and everything. That's a bit scary, yeah. Meaning it's all an aesthetic feeling, should we have like factories and cars everywhere, go to every planet, bomb everything?
No, but I mean, aesthetics is everywhere, obviously. It doesn't mean that everything is aesthetic. It's just that there is an aesthetic dimension to everything. There's also a political and ethical dimension, perhaps religious dimension to everything. So, I mean, aesthetics is everywhere, but it doesn't absorb everything. But I mean, I don't think there's one, you should say that here we have natural things that there are somehow the way that they've always been like that. We always had a family. Then we have an aestheticized layer on top of that, because aesthetics is always part of it. If one now thinks aesthetics not as a canon of forms and proportions or rules, but as the way that we experience something as attractive or beautiful or seductive or sexy, and what kind of vocabulary you will choose.
Yeah, but I think the danger is you're thinking about the way you talk about aesthetics is something that exists and you describe it. But in my world, aesthetics is something that you change, which is
Yeah.
extremely dangerous. Because
Yeah.
I literally know people that if they don't like something, they're gonna create a virus that changes it. They're
Yeah.
they're very bad at talking and thinking, but they're very good at making things that
Yeah.
change, that can go all over the world and change it.
Yeah.
And that scares me a little bit, that there is no limit. If they don't like something, they will not talk about it and say they don't like it. They will actually go and change it. And
Yeah.
that's always a little bit scary. There are people all over, they're everywhere, so that's what gave me the idea. I mean, I'm sorry, that's your field. I'm not
No, no.
I'm just talking from my
Yeah,
perspective.
sure, sure.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, thank you very much. I mean,
Yeah.
you explained some things that were bothering me for a long
Yeah.
time. This
Yeah.
was more like a personal lecture to me
Yeah.
than I hope that those 3 viewers that watched the video are
I hope so. Yeah.
gonna. Do you have any questions for me? That's always the last question.
No, no, no. This was completely improvised, so I haven't really prepared anything.
No,
So
come on. One question. Nobody asked me. Nobody cares about me. Nobody asked
no,
me any questions.
no, no. But I mean, an interesting thing. I remember that I was teaching at the School of Arts and Crafts in Stockholm. Like, stopped there maybe like, oh my God, like 20 years ago. But there were always these discussions, and perhaps not among the students, but among the teachers, because you had the art department and the design department. They couldn't really get along. And we were trying to have seminars, and the science students would come to my art theory seminar and say, oh God, we want to read some theory, because in design department, they would just show slides. Those days they had slides and say, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. You were somehow taught this kind of unconscious appreciation of what's good. Whereas in the art department, we say, good, okay, but why, how come, how, etc., etc. So there was this kind of split between, very critical theoretically in the art department and very practical, as it were, kind of unconsciously absorbing rules and norms in the design department. And I was one of those who tried to bridge that, but it didn't really work. So I was curious, if you think about design teaching, design training, design schools today, is that still a split between art and design in that sense? I mean, that design is somehow always, I mean, you want to change things, right? Obviously, but it's not a critical reflection of why to change things, and it's just change for its own sake. I mean, is that still the case? I mean, I'm asking.
There is an internal need to change. You get
Yeah,
frustrated by something,
yeah,
and one thing is if you get frustrated by a bad salt shaker. Another thing is if you get frustrated by something much bigger, and if it works, then it can be scary. Again, I use the word design for everything that's creation,
yeah,
from
yeah,
houses to
yeah,
spaceships to space,
yeah,
so I don't know, I'm trying to understand it. That's why I'm doing these interviews. I'm trying to understand this, how it works, and I'm interviewing a lot of designers, or I interview people and talk to them about innovation, design,
yeah,
whatever the word is. It's always the same word, meaning pragmatically creating something, and the relationship between thinking and creating, and I'm just trying to figure it out, because there are it's a very strange thing that people do, making things constantly. Everybody wants to make things. Let's make a better salt shaker. And I think there is a lot of, as you said, I mean, you said a great thing. I mean, that previous ideas are finding a new meaning in new people. They transcend the time. And I think this is extremely important. This is, I need to kind of frame it in a design terminology, but I think that's extremely important. And also that aesthetics has no limit, but what scares me is that from point of view of philosophy, aesthetics is something described, but from point of view, or art, but from point of view of design, that's like, it can be, I know like in construction industry,
yeah,
there are people who see an aesthetic. Let's have, concrete buildings everywhere. That's an aesthetic thing, that's their aesthetic, and that ends up in like planet going down because concrete creates CO2, and most of the, a big part of the climate crisis is due to concrete,
yeah,
so, and that's an aesthetic thing. Again, it comes from like Corbusier,
yeah, sure.
from these things, the love of concrete, etc., etc. So I just have to process all this. But you said two great things that are very important for me. But bridging the theory and practice, you defined it. I mean, that's it. It's not there is no direct connection, but it's a morphing and transcending of time, and morphing the current ambition, maybe an irrational, ambition, and then with some kind of, maybe even words, because I never read the entire book of Kant. I never read the entire book but unfortunately, I like 99% of people, I take sound bites and then I attach my ideas, my ambitions to those and use them as somehow they change me.
Yeah.
So it's not.
Just add something. I mean, I read the entire book because I actually translated it into Swedish. So
Yeah, 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 yeah. I know, I
I
know.
don't know if I actually read it, but I translated it. So that's why we're reading it. But I mean, when you say this bridging thing, I just want to stress, and that's more from my point of view as a philosopher, because there's not one way of bridging it, because there are all these multiple ways of bridging and finding
Mm,
connections. And this is also what I think about aesthetic theory. And here I'm very much influenced by someone like Adorno, for instance, that I've been working on and translating the last years. Is that, I mean, there's no point in having a general aesthetic theory about art or design or one of the arts, something, because theory has to be, I mean, obviously a theory has a general sort of general conceptual universal dimension to it. That's inevitable, but it has to be in contact with particulars, and these particulars will change. So I mean, there's no point in trying, okay, what's in common between Mona Lisa and and Rembrandt and Picasso and Marcel Duchamp. There's no point. Of course you can find some general features, but they would be completely uninteresting. The interesting thing is to think philosophically about singular works. I mean, to think about the particulars. That is, of course, a problem because there's a conflict between the particular and the general here. But that conflict is not really, it is not an obstacle. Yes, it is an obstacle, but it is a problem that needs to be faced. And theory, aesthetic theory, is about that problem, how to think the general and the particular together, and to allow both to be in historical change all the time. So this, I think, what is the challenge of aesthetic theory, that what needs to always to start from the present. What kind of art, design, architecture, cinema works are being produced today? And then say, okay, so how does that enable me to approach the past? Not to judge the past by the present standards, but to, as it were, unlock works of the past with the keys that I have today, because I have no other keys. I cannot start anywhere else than where I am. I cannot become a 19th century person. I have to be alive in 2020, but I have to use that kind of knowledge that I have and that has accumulated over history to look at works from the past and make them alive to me.
yeah.
So in that sense, it is it's the problem of combining general and particular, which is the obstacle, but also the source of the energy in aesthetic philosophy, the way I see it anyway.
Yeah.
And I think this is somehow analogous to the problem that the artist or designer is facing, because that person has to use those general concepts, but in such a way that they make sense to a particular work that does not even yet exist.
Yeah, we have the burden. There is the burden that you have to make something. Like
Yeah.
after this meeting, and
Yeah.
I learned, and I have new knowledge, but then I have to go back and open, my tool Photoshop, and I have
Yeah.
to design screens, and then talk to engineers, and I have to program it, and we launch it, and maybe someone uses it. So there is that burden of getting your hands dirty after that. But there is a strong connection between a philosopher 200 years ago or 300 years, like Locke or someone, uh, between what I'm going to do in Photoshop. I see that you created that line now in this last half an hour, 1 hour. You created that line in my mind, that there is a direct connection. Why I'm making something, and why do I choose that button is called that button?
Yeah.
That's funny. And maybe it's not so glamorous when I talk about buttons and Photoshop and talking to programmers, and buying Google ads, but there is a connection. I see that. It's a very, very clear connection. And how does that happen for other people? I don't know. Is it a movie? Is it a book? Is it something? But there is I would not be able to do what I'm doing today if there was no, I don't know, for example, John Locke. If
No.
he didn't write a book, I don't remember the year, sorry. If he didn't write the book, whatever he wrote, I would not be able, I might be like a farmer today.
No.
Literally, there is a strong connection. And, I need to find his grave and say thank you. Or whoever did something before him. So there, I see this direct connection that all the things need to go together and move, and then all the things in the past are augmenting what's happening today. That's interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay. So, ciao. Talk to you later again.
Talk
Cool.
later.
Bye.
Okay.
Ciao. Bye. Bye.
Bye.